The invitation Dom Sterling stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, the glittering Seattle skyline stretching out before him like a tapestry of glass and light. From this height, the city looked almost serene, a maze of streets and buildings softened by the glow of dusk. To the rest of the world, Dom embodied the dream that countless young entrepreneurs chased but rarely caught. At 35, he had built Sterling Technologies from a cramped garage startup into a global empire worth billions. His innovations in cloud security and artificial intelligence had not only transformed industries, but had positioned him as one of the most influential figures on the West Coast. Yet despite the accolades, the wealth, and the power, he felt a void pressing at him more heavily each year, an emptiness that no financial success could fill. His reputation in boardrooms and headlines painted him as relentless, sharp, and unyielding. Few ever glimpsed the quieter side of him, the man who sometimes wished for a simpler life, one where conversations were genuine and relationships were not tainted by ulterior motives. Tonight, however, his mind was fixed on a decision he had not taken lightly. Behind the polished exterior of the man the public admired was a human being who still wrestled with loneliness. A soft knock on the door broke through his thoughts. "Come in," he said, turning from the window. Victoria Hayes entered with her characteristic quiet grace. For 3 years she had been his personal assistant, and during that time she had proven herself indispensable. With her auburn hair neatly pulled back into a professional bun and her tailored charcoal gray suit that spoke of understated elegance, Victoria never sought the spotlight. She was precise, reliable, and intelligent. Where others fawned over his wealth or tried to impress him with hollow flattery, she carried herself with quiet confidence, earning his respect through action rather than empty words. "The quarterly reports are ready for your review," she said, placing a leather portfolio on his mahogany desk. "The board meeting is scheduled for tomorrow at 10, and your lunch with the venture capital partners has been confirmed for Thursday." "Thank you," Daman replied, his voice steady, though his heart carried the weight of what he was about to ask. He paused, running a hand through his dark hair before turning fully toward her. "Victoria, there's something else I need to discuss with you." She raised one eyebrow slightly, the only indication of surprise in her otherwise composed demeanor. "Of course, what can I help you with?" "The Children's Hospital Foundation Gala is next Saturday evening," he began carefully. "I need someone to accompany me. I was hoping you might consider it." For the first time, her usually calm face showed visible hesitation. "I'm not sure that would be appropriate, Mr. Sterling. Isn't this the kind of event where you typically take someone from your social circle?" "That's exactly the problem," Daman said, exhaling as he lowered himself into his leather chair. "Everyone in my social circle has ulterior motives. They see networking opportunities or potential business deals. I need someone who understands the Foundation's mission and can speak intelligently about our technology initiatives without treating the evening like a corporate merger." Her lips pressed together in thought. "You mean me?" "Yes, you," he said firmly. "You've been by my side for 3 years. You know our projects better than most executives. You'd be perfect." The request hung between them, weighted with implications. Victoria wasn't sure how to untangle. She had managed corporate logistics, spoken with partners, and even represented Sterling Technologies in smaller circles. But accompanying him to Seattle's most prestigious gala, on his arm rather than behind a clipboard, that was uncharted territory. That evening, Daman met his longtime friends, Jonathan Pierce and Richard Hawthorne, at the exclusive Emerald City Club for their weekly tennis match. Both men, unlike Daman, had inherited their wealth. They were the type who spent their days managing trust funds and attending high society luncheons, their arrogance sharpened by the ease with which they had received everything in life. "So, who's the lucky lady for Saturday's gala?" Jonathan asked as they toweled off after the match, his tone casual but laced with curiosity. "I'm taking Victoria," Daman replied simply. Knowing exactly what their reaction would be, Richard nearly choked on his energy drink. "Your assistant?" He laughed, shaking his head in disbelief. "Damien, this is the social event of the season. Every influential person in the Pacific Northwest will be there." Jonathan chuckled, his laugh condescending. Please tell me you're joking. Victoria seems like a sweet girl, but she's completely out of her depth for something like this. She probably shops at department stores and has never seen a 7-course meal. She's intelligent, articulate, and understands our business better than most board members, Dom encountered, his jaw tightening. Intelligence doesn't teach you which fork to use, Richard added smugly. You'll spend the entire evening explaining basic social protocols instead of making important connections. Jonathan leaned forward conspiratorially. Catherine Blackwood has been waiting for you to ask her. Her father owns half the commercial real estate in the city, and she knows how to handle herself at these events. She's the obvious choice. Catherine, is everything wrong with my social circle? Daman said sharply. She sees people as stepping stones, conversations as transactions, and your assistant sees you as her boss who signs her paycheck, Richard countered. His smirk unwavering, Daman's hands tightened around his racket until his knuckles whitened, but he said nothing further. Their laughter echoed in his ears long after the match ended. Meanwhile, Victoria sat at her desk that evening long after most employees had gone home. The invitation replayed in her mind as she organized files and confirmed appointments. She had attended corporate events before, but always as part of the machinery, taking notes, managing logistics, observing from the sidelines. Never as an invited guest. Never as someone who would be in the center of attention. She glanced at the Open Sterling Technologies annual report on her desk, her eyes drifting to photos from last year's gala. Elegant women in gowns that shimmered under chandeliers, their jewelry sparkling brighter than city lights. They weren't just wealthy socialites. They were power brokers, decision makers, people whose influence reached far beyond the ballroom. Her phone buzzed with a message from her younger sister, Emma, who was finishing her senior year at the University of Washington. How was work today? Any exciting billionaire drama? Victoria smiled faintly and typed back. He asked me to attend a charity gala with him. Not sure it's a good idea. Seconds later, her phone rang. Please tell me you didn't turn down a date with your gorgeous billionaire boss, Emma's voice teased. It's full of excitement. It's not a date, Victoria protested quickly. It's professional. He needs someone who understands the company's charitable initiatives. Right, because there's absolutely no one else in your massive corporation who could do that, Emma replied sarcastically. Victoria, when was the last time you did something exciting just for yourself? The question lingered long after they ended the call. Victoria's life had become a routine of work, helping her mother with expenses, and making sure Emma had the freedom to focus on her studies. Excitement was a luxury she rarely allowed herself. The next morning, when she arrived early to the office, Daman approached her with sincerity in his eyes. Victoria, about Saturday. If you're not comfortable, I understand. I don't want you to feel pressured because of our working relationship in that moment. She realized his request wasn't about control or appearances, it was genuine. He wasn't commanding her. He was asking, I'll go, she said finally, her voice quiet but firm. But only on one condition. I attend as your colleague, not as arm candy. A rare smile spread across his face. I wouldn't want it any other way. Victoria felt her heart quicken. For better or worse, she had stepped into something that would change her life. Asterisk. Preparing for the unknown, the days leading up to the gala, seemed to blur into one another. Yet each moment pressed heavily on Victoria's mind. The thought of stepping into a ballroom filled with the city's elite carried a weight she could not easily set aside. She had faced deadlines, demanding executives, and the unrelenting pressure of keeping up with Daman Sterling's schedule for years. But this felt different. This felt personal, as though she were being measured not by her professional competence, but by her ability to belong in a world that had never truly been hers. In the quiet hours of the evening, when her apartment in Capitol Hill fell silent, Victoria sat by the small desk in her living room, poring over materials that might prepare her for the event. She studied the history of the Children's Hospital Foundation, memorizing not only its mission, but the individual projects funded through donations, the new pediatric wing, the advanced oncology unit, the mobile clinics that had traveled into underserved rural towns. She wanted to walk into that ballroom with more than polite conversation. She wanted to represent herself as someone who genuinely understood the cause. Asterisk. Still, the challenge of appearance loomed large. She had visited boutique after boutique during her lunch breaks, her eyes drawn to gowns shimmering under showroom lights. Each time her heart sank as she glanced at the price tags. Weeks of salary, sometimes months, were attached to dresses she might wear once. Dresses that seemed more like investments for a lifestyle she didn't live. She almost resigned herself to quietly declining Damon's invitation when she remembered her mother's old collection stored in the attic of their childhood. Home that Friday afternoon, she drove to Bellevue, the comforting familiarity of her family's modest house greeting her like an embrace. Her mother, Eleanor, had once worked as a fashion buyer before life's circumstances pushed her to focus on raising Victoria and her younger sister. Together, they climbed the narrow stairs to the attic, their laughter mingling with the creaks of wooden steps. Among the dust and forgotten boxes, Eleanor carefully pulled out a garment bag. Inside was a midnight blue gown, its fabric rich but timeless. The kind of dress that didn't belong to an era, but to the confidence of the woman who wore it. "Your father always said this made me look like royalty," Elena whispered as she held it up to the light. The gown shimmered faintly, the color deepening where shadows touched it. Victoria reached out, her fingers brushing the fabric. It carried more than stitches and seams. It carried memory, love, and history. For a moment, she saw herself wearing it, not as an outsider, trying to fit into Damon's world, but as her mother's daughter, carrying forward the dignity her family had instilled in her. "Are you sure I can wear it?" Victoria asked softly. "This dress was meant to make the woman inside it feel strong," Eleanor said firmly. "And you, my dear, are stronger than you give yourself credit for." By Saturday morning, her apartment buzzed with activity. Emma had arrived early with an almost theatrical excitement, dragging along her friend James, a theater makeup artist with an eye for elegance. Victoria found herself seated at her small dining table, her auburn hair carefully styled into soft waves, her makeup done with an artist's precision. James had insisted on enhancing her natural features rather than hiding them, remarking that she carried a quiet kind of beauty that shouldn't be overshadowed by excess as she slipped into the gown. The fabric molded against her, its lines flattering without being ostentatious. Eleanor adjusted the hem one last time while Emma clapped her hands in delight. For the first time in years, Victoria looked at her reflection and didn't see just an assistant, a woman defined by schedules and spreadsheets. She saw someone who could walk into a room filled with billionaires and senators and still hold her head high. Meanwhile, across the city, Damon was preparing as well, though his ritual was less about transformation and more about readiness. His tuxedo, custom-tailored in Milan, was laid out on the bed of his penthouse suite. He had worn such attire countless times, but this evening felt different. For once, the anticipation wasn't about who he would meet or which deal might advance. Instead, his thoughts lingered on Victoria, how she might feel stepping into a world that often judged harshly, how others might react, and how he would shield her if the whispers and mockery grew sharp. He remembered Jonathan's condescending laugh, Richard's dismissive smirk. They would be there, and so would Catherine Blackwood, no doubt dressed in something dazzling and determined to make her presence impossible to ignore. Damon knew the room would test Victoria, would test them both, and he was determined not to let her face it alone. When the hour arrived, Damon's black limousine pulled up in front of Victoria's modest apartment building. He stepped out himself rather than waiting for her to descend, a gesture that startled both Victoria and her family, watching from the windows above. He stood tall, his dark tuxedo accentuating the sharpness of his features. But it was the look in his eyes, steady, respectful, that struck Victoria most. She descended the steps carefully, the gown trailing gracefully behind her, her mother and sister watching with pride from the doorway. For a fleeting moment, Damon seemed almost taken aback, his usual composure breaking as his eyes softened. "You look." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "You look extraordinary." Victoria felt warmth rise in her cheeks but held his gaze. "Thank you. And thank you for coming to the door." That was thoughtful. He offered his arm and she accepted, though her heart raced. Together, They entered the limousine, the city lights beginning to flicker against the windows as they drove toward the grand hotel where the gala would be held. Inside the car, silence stretched between them at first, not uncomfortable, but weighted with unspoken thoughts. Daman finally broke it. I know my friends will test you tonight. They'll test us both. But I want you to remember something, Victoria. You don't need to prove yourself to them. Just be who you are. That's more than enough. His words settled into her like an anchor against the storm she feared she would face. For years, she had stood in his shadow, efficient and composed. But tonight, she would step into the light beside him. Whether that light warmed her or burned her remained to be seen as the limousine neared the Grand Hotel. The golden glow of chandeliers spilling through its massive glass windows, Victoria inhaled deeply. The night awaited, filled with challenges, judgments, and possibilities she could not yet imagine. This was no longer just an invitation. It was a threshold, and once she stepped through, nothing in her life for Daminza would be quite the same again. The gala, the limousine, rolled smoothly along the wide, tree-lined avenue, its glossy exterior reflecting the golden lamps that lined the approach to the Grand Regent Hotel. The gala was held here every year, but tonight the building looked more like a palace than a hotel. Its marble steps aglow under a cascade of chandeliers suspended in the glass atrium above. Outside, luxury cars arrived in steady succession, spilling out men in tailored tuxedos and women in gowns worth small fortunes, their laughter and chatter blending into the crisp night air. Paparazzi lined the sidewalks, cameras flashing like bursts of lightning as Seattle's wealthiest and most powerful filtered into the glittering interior. Inside the car, Victoria sat still, her hands folded carefully in her lap as she tried to mask the storm that raged within her. She had prepared for this night, studied every detail she could, and yet nothing could quite still the butterflies that refused to leave her. She stole a glance at Daman. His expression was calm, unreadable. But the way his hand rested loosely against his knee, controlled yet firm, spoke of a man who was bracing himself for more than polite conversation. The limousine came to a halt at the foot of the steps. Daman looked at her, his steel-blue eyes softening. "Ready?" he asked quietly. "As I'll ever be," Victoria replied, her voice steadier than she felt. The driver opened the door, and the world seemed to hold its breath. Daman stepped out first, the cameras clicking rapidly, capturing the image of Seattle's most enigmatic billionaire. Then he turned, extending his hand to Victoria. She placed her fingers lightly in his palm and stepped gracefully onto the carpet, the midnight blue gown trailing like liquid shadow behind her. The crowd shifted instantly. Heads turned. Murmurs rose. Whispers darted from guest to guest. It wasn't Catherine Blackwood on Daman's arm, nor one of the polished heiresses that usually vied for his attention. Instead, it was a woman most of them had never seen before, woman who, despite her modest upbringing, carried herself with a quiet dignity that unsettled the practiced arrogance of those watching. Cameras flashed again, capturing the moment. To the outside world, it looked as though Daman Sterling had unveiled a mystery. And mystery always demanded attention. Inside the ballroom, the grandeur was overwhelming. Crystal chandeliers bathed the room in golden light, their prisms scattering a soft brilliance across polished marble floors. Long tables draped in ivory linen were adorned with centerpieces of orchids and roses, and a string quartet played softly from the far corner, their music weaving through the steady hum of voices. Waiters in crisp white jackets circulated with silver trays of champagne flutes, their movements rehearsed and seamless. As Daman and Victoria entered, conversations faltered. Jonathan Pierce, already standing near the bar, spotted them first. His eyebrows shot up in amusement before a smirk crept across his lips. Beside him, Richard Hawthorne nearly choked on his drink again, just as he had on the tennis court earlier in the week. They exchanged glances that carried both disbelief and mockery. "Well, look at this," Jonathan drawled under his breath. "He actually brought her." Richard leaned forward, whispering just loud enough for their circle to hear. This should be entertaining. Daman ignored them entirely, focusing instead on Victoria. He guided her toward the main reception line, where the event organizers stood ready to greet key benefactors. The chairman of the foundation, an older gentleman with silver hair and a kind smile, extended his hand warmly. "Mr. Sterling, always a pleasure," he said. His eyes flicked to Victoria, and for a moment his smile deepened rather than dimmed. "And who is this lovely lady?" "This is Victoria Hayes," Daman introduced, without hesitation. "My colleague and assistant. She has been instrumental in our company's support of the Foundation's initiatives." Victoria felt the chairman's gaze on her, searching, assessing. She straightened her posture and returned his handshake with poise. "It's an honor to be here. I've read extensively about the Foundation's work, and I'm particularly inspired by the Mobile Clinics project. Access to healthcare in rural areas can transform communities." The chairman's expression shifted from polite formality to genuine interest. "I see Mr. Sterling has chosen his company well tonight. You speak with conviction, Hayes. I look forward to hearing more of your thoughts during dinner." As they moved further into the room, Victoria caught the flicker of Daman's approving smile, subtle but unmistakable. That single look fortified her more than any lecture on etiquette ever could, yet not everyone was as welcoming. Across the room, Catherine Blackwood made her entrance, her emerald green gown catching the light with every step. She was flanked by two senators' wives and an aura of entitlement. The moment her eyes landed on Daman, then slid toward Victoria, her expression hardened. She approached with deliberate grace, her lips curving into a smile that did not reach her eyes. "Daman," she purred, her voice smooth as silk. "I was beginning to think you wouldn't make it." And she let her gaze sweep over Victoria, pausing just long enough to be insulting. "You've brought someone new," Catherine Daman replied with polite indifference. "This is Victoria Hayes." Catherine extended her hand with exaggerated elegance. "So you're his assistant." "Refreshing." Victoria accepted the handshake without flinching, her grip firm but respectful. "It's a pleasure," she said evenly, refusing to let Catherine see the nerves beneath her calm surface. Catherine tilted her head, her eyes narrowing. "I must say you're braver than most. These events can be terribly overwhelming for someone unaccustomed to them." Victoria met her gaze steadily. "Overwhelming, perhaps. But causes like this one are far more important than the room they're held in." For a moment, Catherine's smile faltered, the sharp edge of her confidence blunted. Daman's quiet smirk told Victoria she had struck the right chord. As the evening progressed, Victoria navigated conversations with a grace she hadn't known she possessed. She spoke with donors about the Foundation's mission, asked questions that revealed genuine curiosity, and listened intently. While others filled the air with self-promotion, she offered sincerity. Slowly, the skeptical glances began to soften. A senator's wife complimented her insight. A venture capitalist remarked on her perspective. Even those who had whispered earlier found themselves leaning in when she spoke, but not all eyes softened. Jonathan and Richard lingered nearby, their amusement unrelenting. At one point, Jonathan sidled closer to Daman, his voice dripping with mockery. "I must admit, you've surprised us all, Sterling, bringing your assistant bold move. Though I can't imagine it will do much for your reputation." Daman turned, his gaze sharp as steel. "My reputation is built on integrity, Jonathan. Something you wouldn't understand." Jonathan's smirk faltered, but only slightly. Richard filled the silence with forced laughter. "We'll see how long she lasts under the pressure." Victoria overheard, but instead of shrinking, she stood taller. Their words cut, yes, but they also fueled her resolve. This was more than just surviving an evening. This was proving to them, to Daman, and to herself, that she belonged not because of wealth or status, but because she carried herself with authenticity. As the dinner bell rang and guests began moving toward the grand dining hall, Daman offered Victoria his arm once again. "You've already silenced more doubts tonight than I could have imagined," he murmured for her ears. "Alone." She glanced at him, her lips curving into the faintest of smiles. "The night's still young. Who knows what else I'll surprise you with." They stepped into the dining hall together, the chandeliers blazing overhead. The night poised to unfold with challenges yet to come. Asterisk the trial by fire. The grand dining hall of the Regent was a spectacle of elegance, the kind that whispered old money and cultivated prestige in every polished surface. High-arched ceilings were painted with frescoes of mythological figures, their golden halos glowing softly under the chandeliers that seemed to hang like captured constellations above the guests. The tables were dressed in immaculate white linen, their centers adorned with towering arrangements of roses and orchids, while crystal glasses caught the light and refracted it into prisms that danced across the room. The low hum of polite conversation filled the hall as waiters in white gloves ushered guests toward their seats. Dam escorted Victoria to their table, one situated near the center of the room, a position reserved for high-profile benefactors and major donors. The place cards gleamed in embossed gold, and beside Damon's name sat hers, Victoria Hayes, written with an equal flourish. She hesitated only a moment before taking her seat, acutely aware of the eyes still lingering on her. Some curious, some skeptical, some openly judgmental. The first course arrived. A delicate arrangement of salmon tartare, with microgreens and caviar pearls. Victoria watched as others around her began with casual ease, navigating the array of silverware that had been placed with surgical precision beside each plate. She had studied enough to know the basics, but nerves threatened to betray her composure. Damon, sensing her hesitation, leaned slightly toward her, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Outside in, always. "Don't overthink it," he whispered, his tone calm and reassuring. Relief flickered across her face as she picked up the correct fork, grateful not only for the reminder, but for the quiet way he offered it. Without drawing attention to her uncertainty, it was a small gesture, but it anchored her, reminding her that she wasn't alone in this. Around the table, the conversations began to swell. A senator's wife to her left asked Damon about his company's latest expansion into Asia, while across the table a venture capitalist began recounting the intricacies of a recent deal. Victoria listened, her mind racing to find an entry point. She wasn't a senator, nor an heiress, nor a corporate titan. What did she have to offer in this rarefied world? The answer came when the foundation's chairman, seated 2 places away, turned to her with genuine curiosity. "Ms. Hayes, I was struck earlier by your mention of the mobile clinics. Tell me, what aspect of the project resonates most with you?" For a split second, Victoria felt the weight of the entire table pivot toward her. Catherine Blackwood, seated nearby in all her emerald finery, tilted her head with a predator's smile, waiting for her to stumble. Jonathan Pierce and Richard Hawthorne sipped their wine with undisguised amusement. Eager for her to falter in the spotlight, Victoria drew a steady breath. "Access," she said simply, her voice carrying a quiet strength. It's easy to assume healthcare is a given when we live in cities like this. But for families in rural towns or underfunded areas, even basic services are unreachable. The mobile clinics don't just bring doctors and equipment. They bring dignity. They remind people that their lives matter, that their children's futures matter. That's what resonates with me, the idea that compassion can be mobile, that it can travel to the very places where it's most desperately needed. Silence followed. But it wasn't the silence of dismissal. It was the silence of consideration, of unexpected respect. The senator's wife leaned forward, her eyes softening. "That's beautifully put," she said warmly, "and very true. Sometimes those of us who fund these causes forget what it feels like for the people on the receiving end." Even the chairman nodded with approval. "Well said, Ms. Hayes. It is refreshing to hear sincerity among so much polished rhetoric." Catherine's smile flickered, brittle around the edges. "How touching," she murmured, though her voice was dipped in condescension. "You make it sound so simple, but these projects are complex, expensive, and require more than just good intentions." "Of course they do," Victoria replied evenly, meeting her gaze. "But good intentions are the reason anyone begins the work in the first place. Without them, no amount of resources will matter." The table grew quiet again, the words settling heavier than even she anticipated. Damon's glance toward her carried both pride and a hint of awe. For all her nerves, Victoria had spoken with a clarity that cut through the noise of politics and wealth. The courses continued, each more elaborate than the last lobster bisque. seared lamb with rosemary, delicate sorbets between plates. Victoria navigated them with growing confidence, her earlier fears fading into a rhythm of conversation and composure. Yet not all moments were so smooth. At one point, Jonathan leaned across the table, his smile laced with mockery. "Tell me, Ms. Hayes," he began, "when you're not accompanying your employer to galas, what exactly do you do? Schedule meetings? Fetch coffee?" The jab was thinly veiled, and several at the table chuckled politely. Catherine's eyes sparkled with cruel amusement. Victoria could have wilted under the scrutiny. She could have laughed nervously or brushed it off. But instead, she placed her fork down, straightened her posture, and answered with calm precision. "I manage Mr. Sterling's schedule, yes, but I also oversee international contracts, negotiate with vendors, and coordinate philanthropic partnerships that directly impact the foundation we're supporting tonight. So, if you'd like, I can fetch you a coffee too, though I doubt you'd survive a day managing the pace of my work." Asterisk. The response struck like a spark in dry tinder. The senator's wife stifled a laugh behind her napkin, and even the venture capitalist across the table smirked in appreciation. Jonathan blinked, his smirk faltering for the first time all evening. Richard coughed awkwardly into his glass. Unsure whether to laugh or retreat, Damon's expression didn't shift outwardly, but the subtle glint in his eyes told her everything. Was proud. By the time dessert was served, a decadent chocolate souffle with a drizzle of raspberry coulis, the room had begun to shift. The whispers that had once trailed them like shadows had softened into nods of acknowledgement and even admiration. Victoria's sincerity, her refusal to crumble under pressure, had begun to disarm the skepticism. She hadn't come to the gala to prove anything to anyone, but in holding true to herself, she had done exactly that. As the dinner drew to a close, and the chairman rose to thank the donors, Damon leaned toward her once more. His voice was low, but his words carried more weight than the chandeliers above them. "You've done tonight what I never could. You silenced them without raising your voice. You reminded them what this evening is supposed to be about." Victoria glanced at him, her heart thudding in her chest. "I only said what I believed. That's what makes it powerful," he replied, as the applause swelled around them. Victoria realized something she had not allowed herself to feel in years. She wasn't just surviving the evening, she was thriving in it. And though the night was not over, she knew she had already crossed a threshold from which she could never return to the shadows of anonymity. Asterisk. The revelation the dinner concluded with the clinking of crystal glasses, polite applause for the chairman's speech, and the gentle hum of the string quartet resuming in the background. Guests began to drift from the long dining tables into the adjoining ballroom, where the chandeliers shone even brighter, and the parquet floor gleamed like liquid gold under the lights. It was time for dancing, networking, and the subtle games of influence that defined these nights. Damon offered Victoria his arm again, and she accepted, her movements now smoother, more assured than they had been when they first walked into the hall. Still, as they stepped into the ballroom, she felt the weight of dozens of eyes pressing on her once more. For all she had accomplished at dinner, she knew the night was far from over. The whispers had not fully died. Catherine Blackwood was far from finished. Music swelled as the quartet transitioned into a waltz. Couples began to glide across the polished floor. Damon led Victoria gently onto the dance floor, his hands steady on hers. His gaze fixed on her with a calm confidence that soothed her nerves. She had never been much of a dancer, but in his arms, the steps came more naturally than she expected. He guided her effortlessly, his movements precise, but never overbearing. Around them, Catherine watched with thinly veiled disdain, her emerald dress shimmering as she leaned toward Jonathan and Richard. "It's a performance," she whispered, her tone sharp enough to cut glass. "She'll stumble sooner or later. She doesn't belong here. Everyone knows it." But as the music swirled and Victoria moved gracefully across the floor, it became clear to more and more of the onlookers that she wasn't stumbling. She wasn't pretending. She was simply being herself, genuine, graceful, and unshaken by the malice directed her way. That authenticity drew notice in a room where so many wore masks. After the dance, Damen and Victoria made their way toward a cluster of donors gathered near the tall, arched windows overlooking the city. Among them were two senators, a prominent philanthropist, and a tech mogul known for his brutal honesty. Catherine, sensing an opportunity, swept in swiftly. Her smile sharpened into a blade. "Mr. Sterling," she began sweetly, though her eyes were anything but warm, "I must say you have surprised us all tonight. Bringing your assistant to such an important event, it's certainly unconventional. Some might even call it reckless." The words hung in the air like smoke, poisonous and deliberate. Several guests shifted uncomfortably while Jonathan and Richard smirked from the sidelines. Waiting for Damon's response before Damon could speak, Victoria stepped forward, her voice calm but resolute. "Reckless? No, I think it's courageous. Mr. Sterling could have brought someone whose last name carried weight, someone polished to fit the mold of these gatherings. But he chose differently. He chose someone who believes in the cause this evening is about. Isn't that the point of charity? To look beyond status and remember the humanity we all share?" Her words cut clean through the tension, drawing the attention of every nearby ear. The philanthropist, a woman in her 70s with decades of influence behind her, nodded approvingly. "Well said, my dear. Too often we forget that sincerity is worth more than appearances." The tech mogul, known for mocking pretension, gave a rare smile. "She's got a sharper mind than half the boardrooms I've sat in. I like her." Catherine's expression faltered, her mask slipping just long enough to reveal her frustration. She attempted to recover, but the shift in the room was undeniable. Jonathan and Richard exchanged uneasy glances, their amusement souring into something closer to discomfort. Damon finally spoke, his voice firm, carrying the weight of authority that had built his empire. "Catherine, the only reckless thing here is the assumption that people's worth is measured by their last name or the label on their gown. Tonight is about the children who will benefit from this foundation, not about our egos. If you can't remember that, then perhaps you've forgotten why you're here." The silence that followed was deafening. Catherine's lips parted, but no words came. She turned sharply and excused herself, her emerald gown disappearing into the crowd like a vanishing specter. Jonathan and Richard quickly busied themselves at the bar. Their bravado finally muted. Victoria stood quietly beside Damon, her pulse quickening. She hadn't expected to speak so boldly, but the words had come naturally, as though the room itself demanded them. Damon glanced at her, his expression softened with admiration that reached deeper than words. As the evening wore on, something remarkable began to unfold. Guests who had initially dismissed her now sought her out, asking her thoughts on philanthropy, technology, and even her own story. She spoke honestly, never pretending to be more than she was, and in that honesty, she disarmed them all. For once, the gala was not about who wore the most expensive gown, or who had closed the largest deal. It became about authenticity. By the time the final speeches were made, and the evening drew to a close, Victoria realized she had crossed an invisible line. She had entered the gala as an outsider, a curiosity at best. But she was leaving as someone who had earned respect on her own terms. Damon's friends had mocked her, Catherine had tried to humiliate her, and yet she had stood her ground with grace outside. As the limousine door closed behind them and the city lights flickered past the windows once more, silence settled between Damon and Victoria, the awkward silence of strangers, but the comfortable silence of two people who had faced a storm together and emerged stronger. Finally, Damon turned to her, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it. "You proved them all wrong tonight." Victoria met his gaze, her eyes steady. "I wasn't trying to prove anything. I just wanted to be myself. And that," he said, his lips curving into the faintest of smiles, "is what makes you extraordinary." The words lingered in the air, unspoken possibilities shimmering between them like the city's skyline outside the glass. For the first time in years, Damon felt the emptiness within him begin to shift, replaced by something unfamiliar yet undeniable. And for Victoria, who had spent so long in the background of other people's lives, tonight had shown her that she could stand in the light not as an accessory, not as someone defined by others, but as herself. The gala was over, but the story it had begun was only just unfolding.